Good afternoon. If I could get everyone's attention. Everyone take a seat. Get everyone to take a seat. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to your Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee. I am joined by my colleagues, Council Members Buscaino and Rue. We are expecting Ms. Martinez and Rodriguez, and we will get started. We're going to start with general public comment. Actually, we're going to start with multiple comment cards. We have one multiple comment card. Mr. Herman, why don't you come up while we're getting ready here? Mr. Herman, is Mr. Herman here?
I'm on my way, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, that will be 2 minutes.
What's that?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, yeah. You'll get a minute for general public comment after your 2 minutes for the items. So go ahead, Mr. Herman.
Cumulative of 3 minutes.
First, you have 2 minutes on the items.
Thank you, City Administrative Officer. Relative to the financial status of the City Public Report is that we continue to discriminate against the elderly and the disabled for poor infrastructure. Just as we had in this, can you fucking just sit down and listen? God damn, no respect. What kind of niggers work this house? This is my casa. I'm not Justin Wesson stealing money from the public. Come on.
Keep the items regarding the items in front of us, Mr. Herman. In addition to all my concerns and reports, just like I said, Los Angeles Department of Transportation report. Well, how did the nigger come? Dickless. On demand. Personally, I walk here because I have mobility service. Mobility to walk, mobility to get a train, mobility to catch the metro, mobility to do all sorts of fucking good things that I do in life just to decompress my dumb nigger ass working with white politician niggers like you, Jew. Then item 4, another public work regarding the city attorney, Mr. Fauble. Mr. Fauble, don't fall. Draft the fucking ordinance granting Armando Herman to stick his pipeline franchise right up your fucking California water line. And to install and retain my operation, how to fuck the city that fucks me with Michael Moore's big payday. In addition to Weezer and Plum and that of that nigger Dawson, but he's white. Downtown Los Angeles to assess and identify infrastructure. I already proved my point. You fucking assholes don't follow the American Disability Act and you discriminate against people with disabilities. Okay.
So my general public comment is this, folks. You can't keep these niggers from stealing from you. You're gonna work your fucking life off coming to these jackasses like, Mommy, Mommy. And the bitch doesn't do shit for you, but let Van Nuys traffic children in the Spearmint Rhino. And yet, cops still fuck cadets. It's a proven fact. The LA Times put it in the paper. A police officer taking a child home to barbecue her on his dick. So don't be blind. Don't be bullshitting and lying to people that the city is a great place to live. Who fucking wants to live with a big, fat, misery cunt, 2 of them, that fuck up your city in Van Nuys and Pacoima? Who wants that shit? I'm the real Republican. I am the Donald Trump of the 22nd century.
Your comments related to the committee, please.
I got 7 fucking seconds, you fucking Jew. So the next time you put an innocent man to a tree for Christmas, fuck you, 42 USC, 1983.
Okay, unless there's an objection from my colleagues, I'd like to move items 4 and 6 on consent. I'd like to continue item 5. Seeing no objection, that will be the order. Now, items 7 and 8 we'll take for an amendment, but we do have one public comment card on that, and then we'll do Mr. Kretz right after that. So there's an item, there's a Johnny Pineda on item number 8. Please.
Good afternoon, board members, council members. My name is Johnny Pineda, and I work for Councilmember Gilbert Cedillo. This is related to item number 8, the closure of 2 alleys, one on Alvarado Street and one on Jameswood Street. And we would like to amend our motion to make it clear the reason why we want to go ahead and temporarily close the alley. It's for public safety reasons. We received 2 requests from Ramper Police Division, and I'm going to go ahead and share that letter with you. And I also have with me signatures from the community requesting our office to temporarily close the alley. This alley has become a nuisance to our community. There's drug activity, prostitution, and even individuals have been killed in that alley. So please receive this amendment. I really hope you can support it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Herman, we're hearing your comments during his comment. This is your last warning, your only warning. Anything else, and I'm going to have to ask you to leave. On items 7 and 8, there is an amendment that's been offered. If you could read that into the record, the amendment for 7 and 8, and then we'll take those on consent.
Item number 7, the amendment is to adopt the recommendations contained in the Bureau of Engineering report, amended as follows: that the City Council, subject to the approval of the Mayor, authorize, number 1, the Controller to establish an account in the Capital Improvement Expenditure Program, Fund 100, Department 54, entitled LAC Bridge MTC Culver Imperial for the Los Angeles County Bridge Maintenance Agreement. Number 2, Controller to transfer $40,000 from the 2017-18 CIEP Fund 100, Department number 54, account 00P234, titled Contingency for Construction, to the LAC Bridge MTC Culver Imperial CIEP account. Number 3 is city engineer to execute an agreement with the County of Los Angeles, subject to the review by the city attorney as to form and legality, for the contribution of $40,000 towards this project. Number 4, Controller to issue payment to the County of Los Angeles in the amount of $40,000 for the purposes of participating in a bridge maintenance agreement with the county, to be withdrawn from the LAC Bridge MTC Culver Imperial CIEP account. And the last recommendation for number 7, number 5, is City Administrative Officer to make any technical changes as necessary in order to effectuate the intent of this authorization. For item number 8, the amendment is as recommended by BOE in consultation with CD1 to amend the motion to state the following: I therefore move that under California Vehicle Code Section 21101.4, the Bureau of Engineering, with the assistance of the Department of Transportation and the Los Angeles Police Department, be directed to report immediately with recommendations to close and gate below described alleys. These alleys have become a nuisance, and placing gates will reduce the incident of criminal activity and will create a safer community for the neighborhood. These alleys are as follows: the alley in the rear of 847 South Union Avenue, Los Angeles, California, 90017. This alley is bounded by 8th Street on the north, James M. Wood Boulevard on the south, Beacon Avenue on the west, and South Union on the east. The other alley is in the rear of 642 South Alvarado Street, Los Angeles, California, 90057. This alley is bounded by 6th Street on the north, Wilshire Boulevard in the south, Alvarado Street on the west, and Westlake to the east.
Okay. Long amendments. We appreciate you reading them in. Without objection, so thank you for that. Without objection from my colleagues, unless there's an objection, we will adopt items 7 and 8 as amended on consent. Seeing no objection, that will be the order. And I don't know if I said it before formally, but now general public comment is closed. And we're going to, before we move to item 1 of our colleagues is here to speak, speak on item 2. He has another committee, so we wanted to take him before we move formally into the agenda. So Mr. Koretz, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Well, Thank you, Mr. Blumenfield and colleagues. I'm very concerned about the trend we've had recently in terms of scooters and their danger. When they first came to Transportation Committee, I'd only seen a couple of them. Didn't consider that too much of a threat, but in the ensuing time, I've personally probably seen at least 1,000 in use just in my own neighborhood on Beverly and on 3rd, and I had some obvious observations. One, I saw one helmet, and it's not legal to ride them without a helmet. 1,000 or so rides that I've seen, one helmet. So clearly that isn't being observed. Most riders are on the sidewalk. It's illegal under state law and under the regulations that we're proposing to ride on the sidewalk. It's also illegal under state law to ride in the street on a commercial corridor posted at 25 miles an hour or more. I've also seen 2 riders on a scooter. Once I even saw 3. That's clearly not safe, leading to some people falling off and at least getting pretty dinged up. There are a variety of other violations, including a lot of small children riding on these. I've seen families where they've encouraged it, mother, father, 12-year-old daughter, 8-year-old brother. I mean, that's just the way it is. So when it came back to committee, I did vote for what we proposed in terms of policy, which I think would be good policy. And I said, but how do you enforce this? He said, well, it's not the purview of our committee, it's the purview of your committee, hence why I'm here. And I think what I really want to propose is that we look seriously at what I think is a catch-22, which is if you ban and actually enforce a set of regulations that say you cannot ride on the sidewalk and you can't ride on the street and you can't ride without a helmet, basically that's a business model that fails if you actually enforce. So we either destroy the business model and we realize that we're doing that, or we pass this and say, well, those are our regulations, wink, wink, but we're not going to enforce it, and we're going to allow most of these to operate unsafely. I think until we can figure out whether there is a business model that works under enforcement, I think you should hold it in committee and really try to sort that piece out. Because if we have to enforce, and we know we're going to kill the business model, we might as well just pull the Band-Aid off and ban them. And that is something that it is my motion, and also making its way through council, to at least ban them until we sort this out. We haven't had any fatalities yet. We've had plenty of minor injuries, like people that have an elbow broken in 10 places. Those are pedestrians. We certainly have a lot of people diving out of the way of these. I've even had to do that on camera, doing an interview about the scooters. So you see it everywhere. I get tons and tons of complaints from my constituents about the various elements of this. So I believe there probably is no way to do this safely and legally. So the question is, do we pass regulations that we intend not to make enforceable? Do we plan some major enforcement where we do a large amount of outreach to the public through the press, and then we write 1,000 citations in a day so everyone gets the message, and those citations are moving violations so they actually bite the violator, which is probably the only way to truly enforce? How do all those things play? So are we really trying to make this work? But can we find a way to make it legal and safe, which I have my doubts about. So I hope you can sort out all those questions before this motion leaves this committee. And if that requires some extra thought, I would propose that you hold it in committee until you figure it out. Thank you for your consideration.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Koretz, and we will do our best as a committee to sort this out. So thank you. and appreciate the input. So now we're going to move to items 1 and 2, and we're going to take those up together. Mr. Espinosa, would you please read those items into the record?
Item number 1 is the report from the Board of Public Works and City Administrative Officer relative to the financial status report for the Public Works Trust Fund for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2016 and June 30th, 2017. Item number 2 are reports from the City Administrative Officer and Board of Public Works relative to the Nexus Study of the Public Works Trust Fund and the establishments of rules and guidelines. This one was also referred to the Personnel and Animal Welfare Committee.
We'll start with an overview. Dr. Campos.
Good afternoon, council members. Fernando Campos, Executive Officer with the Board of Public Works. It's a pleasure to be before your committee to present a long effort that has been under my purview and also the Board of Public Works looking at the Public Works Trust Fund. The items before you are twofold. One is the annual report for the financial trust for the Public Works Trust Fund for fiscal year 2016 and also 2017. In addition to that, it's a Nexus study that's before you to hopefully debottleneck about $6 million with your concurrence today and ultimately the City Council to use those funds and put them into work, into public infrastructure projects and investments across the entire city. So it's been an effort for the last 18 months or so trying to get to this point. So it's a true pleasure to be before you to present and let you know what we have been doing in the Board of Public Works. So quickly, if you go to the next slide, please. The Public Works Trust Fund, so I thought I would just present an overview of the Public Works Trust Fund, the Nexus study, and also some of the financials. So I'll go through the presentation you have before you. In addition to that, you do have two simple handouts, one with a breakdown of the $6 million that's going to be proposed before you. In addition to that, a pinpoint map graph of where that money or the deposits are located. So I'll work through those documents and those tools that you have before you as I present my information to you. But really quick, in terms of some of the benefits of having active fund management and looking at why it's important to do a Nexus study and why it's important to have financial reporting in place, it's really about enhancing public works infrastructure and also funding these projects to get the city going and funding and investing into the city as a whole. One of the benefits that we needed to tease out, or one of the challenges that we needed to tease out, was to look at the California Mitigation Fee Act that was imposed back in 1989. And basically what that Mitigation Fee Act says that anytime the city or any municipality collects a fee that's mitigating another effect, those fees have to be put into that specific project at that specific location, and any interest earned on those monies need to go back to the depositor. Just quickly, in terms of the Public Works Trust Fund, the funds that we collect are from depositors. They're not taxpayer-based money. So this is not money that we just collect from taxation. It's monies that are there for a specific purpose, for a specific service. In addition to that, when we were going through the Nexus study, we were really looking at conducting a benchmark study. We wanted to know what other municipalities were doing across the entire state of California. So we hired and retained the Bronner Group, which we have our consultant here that will present the findings of the Nexus study. But we did look at 38 different municipalities across the entire city to find out exactly how are they managing these trust funds and how are they managing and complying with the California Mitigation Fee Act. In addition to that, we also did some findings and determinations and examine one specific account. When I say one specific account, this is very key because the Public Works Trust Fund as a whole has about $124 million. There's 29 accounts within the Public Works Trust Fund. There's approximately 12,500 deposits as a whole. The Nexus study is only looking at one of 29 accounts, and it's specifically targeting only 12 million of the $124 million that's in the Public Works Trust Fund. So that's very important to keep that number in mind as we go through the discussions of the Nexus study, because it's only one of 29 accounts. It's only 12 million of 124 million. The Board of Public Works and the Department of Public Works as a whole manages close to about $10 billion in assets, about 209 special funds as a whole. So the Public Works Trust Fund is only one of 209 funds. Next slide, please. So one of the important things about the Public Works Trust Fund and managing other people's money, it's really in trust for or on the benefit for other folks. The folks are depositors, they're residents that would like to move forward with a development project. So having good governance is extremely important. We also do monthly reconciliation of our monies. We look at making sure that we're transferring the B deposits. Just to give you a key note, about 3-4 years ago, the Board of Public Works was only transferring about $500,000 to $1 million to the general fund from B deposit monies. Since the Board of Public Works has been looking at this very closely, we have been able to increase that funding source to about $10 to $12 million per year being transferred to the general fund. And that's because we have that governance and we have that oversight from the Board of Public Works. In addition to that, there has to be an internal control, not only the administrator, but also the accountant and the collector. I have a picture here that basically illustrates a bar, a tripod, and we have some issues going on with internal controls and making sure that the funds are being managed. We are hanging strong. However, there are some band-aids that we're using to keep us strong, and therefore I believe that what's going to be proposed before you will make us stronger as we manage these funds. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Board of Public Works oversees the Public Works Trust Fund. The fund has about $124 million as of June 2017. The other item that's before you is also the report that's for fiscal year 2016. At that time, we had $107 million as a whole. Next slide, please. In terms of where the money is, it's really broken up into 3 major accounts. One account is our B permits. So these B permits are for development projects. So we currently have about $34 million. This money has actually increased for this fiscal year by about $2 million. So we have about $36 million there. General improvement, about $46 million. Basically what this means is that it's a deposit. In the event that a developer does not complete a project, or if a resident pulls a permit and doesn't complete that project, that guaranteed deposit basically gets forfeited and then transferred over into a special account. That special account then requires the city of Los Angeles to follow through and invest what that original developer was supposed to do, in which they did not do in the first place. Once they default, or once that money does not get spent from that guaranteed deposit, it gets transferred into the special account. The special account is what the Nexus Study is all about. This is the $12 million. So currently we have about $46 million in active projects. Some of that money, if the projects do not get completed, they may end up in the special account in the future. Next slide, please. So I think at this point, it's really good to stop and have the Bronner Group come in and talk about the Nexus Study. And then as soon as the Bronner Group presents the Nexus Study and some of the results and the recommendations, I'll come back to finalize the presentation on the Nexus Study and then talk a little bit about the Public Works Trust Fund, the annual reports, and some of the recommendations that the CAO has made before you, and provide our thoughts and opinions from the Board of Public Works perspective. So with that, I'll present Ms. Gila Bronner from Chicago, and she's here presenting on the Nexus Study for us.
Thank you.
Ms. Bronner, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about the Nexus Study. An RFP was issued in February of 2017 to conduct the Nexus Study. In June, the Bronner Group responded to that RFP, and in June of 2017, we were retained to conduct the study, which had 2 primary objectives. The first was to determine how the Mitigation Fee Act impacted the utilization of the Public Works Trust Fund deposits, and then specifically to identify, we're 2 slides, sorry. One more, there you go. And to identify the nexus. And nexus is an interesting word. It's a word that we often use ourselves in conversation when we're trying to compare or to correlate one topic to another, one issue to another. And here we're looking at correlating a relationship of a specific deposit to a project type and location. And that's very important to remember, because much of our work was really looking at identifying and researching the source documentation to be able to specifically look at project type and location and any of these other related details of deposits. There were 4 specific deliverables that emanated from our project work, which was conducted from June of 2017 to essentially when the report was issued at the end of February, with most of our work concluding a little bit before that. There was a benchmarking study that Dr. Campos alluded to and spoke about relating to the case review of the Mitigation Fee Act and what has already taken place, not just in California, but actually similar kinds of legislation that has been enacted in other states as well. Then to specifically look at the deposits in the special projects account, which is number 4873. Dr. Campos mentioned there's approximately $12 million in that account, but given the nature and scope and the level of effort that was required with the research, we actually only looked at a portion of the deposits in that account, and I'll speak specifically about that. Coming out of the deposits review, we then developed alternative policy options for consideration by the Board of Public Works, and then identified and developed some specific observations and recommendations to improve processing and internal control associated with these deposits. Next slide, thank you. So our 4 phases of work paralleled the stated objectives and the specific deliverables we were working towards. There was data gathering and analysis, the benchmarking and case law review, the deposit review and analysis, and the policy development and next steps. Next. With respect to the benchmarking and the case law, we collected information from 23 cities, interviewed 25 individuals, responded to the survey. We conducted 8 in-depth interviews, and what we found was that all in all, there were different experiences across the state in implementing the Mitigation Fee Act, but there were 2 very important aspects that if you are subject to the Mitigation Fee Act, there were 2 key compliance requirements that needed to be followed. One was establishing that nexus, that reasonable relationship for use of funds, and then there's a requirement to report on the funds at least once every 5 years. Following that, in looking at the deposits themselves, of the approximately 12 million, next slide, sorry, of the 12 million, we segregated all of those deposits by size. And what we found was about 56% of the 12 million were $100,000 or more. So we thought it made sense to start with the deposits that had the largest dollar value. So we grouped it into 4 different categories, and as time permitted, because we came into this not knowing what the status was of the documentation that might be available. There was a lot of interviews in terms of phase 1 data gathering and documentation review, just to be able to gather the information to begin to look at for each individual deposit, looking at location, looking at purpose, looking at the disposition of the various projects. So with these groupings, we then proceeded to identify the different types of deposits. We did not find any deposits associated with development impact fees that would indeed require compliance with Mitigation Fee Act requirements. That's good news. We also found there were 3 types of deposits that resided within the count that did not require compliance with Mitigation Fee Act requirements. And those 3 are the permit fees collected as refundable deposits, permit fees that were collected in lieu of construction deposits, and funds transferred from the settlement of defaulted bonds. So as we look at, in summary, the nature of the deposits, of approximately 5.9, so close to half of the 12 million, only reflected 132 deposits. And as you recall, Dr. Campos mentioned there are 12,000 plus deposits overall in the trust fund. So there are still, of the 360 deposits that are in the special projects account, we were only able to tackle 132 over that 6-7 month period. But that alone did identify quite a bit of revenue that is available for various purposes. So we have included both a deposit analysis by council district, and I would call your attention to the center column, which is indeed those dollars that are available for Board of Public Works action overall which tally up to the 5.895 million. And the allocation by council district is as it relates to the detail associated with each of these deposits and where they would belong and to the projects, where the projects themselves are occurring. And we're happy to come back and talk about that. But on the next slide, coming out of it, there were actually 6 policy options that were identified as we categorize the various groupings of the dollars. There's a certain portion which we call at-will dollars. These are available to be used at will. They can be used for any project in any location or for administration of the Public Works Trust Fund. So that is, and we identified $487,950 that is actually available broadly. Then there's a group of the deposits that can be used for any project. So it's a specific location, but any project. And that's 1.533 million. Then there's a group that can actually be used for in any location, but for a specific project. So it's sort of the inverse of the other group. And finally, there's a group that must be used for a specific project in a specific location where that nexus has been identified, and that's close to 3.9 million. And so then there are 2 other groupings. There was one group, one deposit of $30,000 that actually needs to be refunded to a current customer, and then there's the remaining $6+ million that has yet to be analyzed, which also reflects an additional 227 deposits. So all in all, coming out of it, the last piece on the observation and recommendations focuses on three main areas. First, historically, there have been weaknesses in the policy and procedures and the internal controls over the processing, tracking, and accountability for the fee deposits. And there are many hands that touch it along the way throughout the process, throughout the development and approval process. We believe specifically as it relates to the recommendations, there are some easy technological solutions in terms of investing and leveraging technology to strengthen the internal control framework, but also to develop detailed policies and procedures to support from the moment a deposit is received, how we record it, how we track it, how we account. Much of that is done from a financial management perspective, but we're really looking at the administrative control and the administrative policies and procedures so that we have proper documentation. And then while right now we did not find deposits in this account subject to the Mitigation Fee Act requirements, they're good. The actual policies and procedures and requirements of the Act would suggest that some of them should be adopted anyway. Just once again to support proper stewardship and accountability for the dollars that would find their way not just in the special projects account, but throughout the Public Works Trust Fund. And this relates to segregating different types of deposits into accounts and documenting and updating the plan every 5 years and providing accountability for the deposits. And lastly, the last grouping of recommendations is really about missing documentation. It took an awfully long time just to be able to obtain source documentation and validate information for 100-some deposits. And again, if you think about the perspective and you're looking at 12,000 presently in the fund. So there is not only a lot of work that's required, but it's ongoing. This is a living fund. And clearly, we think it would be advantageous for Public Works to have a dedicated resource that has that assigned accountability over this whole process associated with fee deposits, and to be able to provide that accountability, to be able to develop dashboards to provide you with information on a current basis as to the status of the various projects, where they're occurring, and all of the deposits associated with it. And so with that, if you have any either specific questions for me or would like Dr. Campos to bring it home, I'm
appreciate it. Well, why don't we start a question based on that last point that you made about the technology upgrades. I like the idea, and by the way, thank you for all the work on this. This is really a great report that is going to help us sort through this and be able to spend some money that's inactive that should be active. And so that's a very positive thing for the city. And so we appreciate the hard work you've done. On the technology upgrades, you talked about the weaknesses and segregating, tracking. Can we use the funds from the at-will category to fund these upgrades? Has the board explored the technological upgrades necessary to improve the deposit tracking? How much would those cost, and is there enough money within the system to pay for those? Because that, off the cuff, would seem like a very logical use of those funds.
It does seem like a very logical use for those funds, and they can indeed be used to support administration of the Public Works Trust Fund. In terms of estimating costs, the scope of our work did not include actually assessing the specific solutions in terms of providing you with a budgeted cost for that today. But we believe that there are, within that, certainly within that dollar, and actually other funds that, as you proceed and continue to do the analysis here, to be able to fund both the solution around whether, and technology is only one piece of it, it's really improving the whole processes and procedures and internal controls, but having a point of accountability to ensure that that is being addressed. And I think that is better served by having somebody have full-time responsibility for that rather than a periodic consultative analysis. In fact, I'm not sure that one person alone can do this. For us, we had a team of half a dozen people that spent that time. It wasn't one person. So if you think about it from that standpoint, there were several FTEs that were working on it, and we only made it through 120 some. So I think to specifically, that pot of money is available, and unless Dr. Campos wants to add more to that, there may be other sources as well, but certainly that was, I think, part of the purpose even within the Mitigation Fee Act to say that it's important to provide accountability and you should use some of these resources to administer those funds.
And to your point about having a person, our colleague, Mr. Koretz, who was here, communicated when it came to his committee in PAWS, Personnel Committee, that he wanted this position for just that very reason. So, colleagues, when we get to it, I'm going to recommend that we do include that position that the PAWS Committee included when they heard this item, which would concur with which concurs with the Bureau of Public Works recommendation. Correct, Mr. Campos? Yeah, which is, I'll make that as one of our recommendations. Just thought I'd throw that out there now since you raised it as a point, but it was put in by PAWS Committee, and I think we should stick with that recommendation. Second issue on and this may be more for Mr. Campos, a lot of the available funding has been budgeted for fiscal year 18-19. And for the future years, how is the board going to handle the remaining funds in the special projects account should a determination be made that they're available for use on public works projects? When they're available, would they be part of the annual budget process, or would they be something that the council districts would have more discretion over throughout the year?
It's definitely going to take, Fernando Campos again, it's definitely going to take some synchronization with the CAO's office and also the mayor's office. The goal is that we would start reviewing these deposits and bring them to the Board of Public Works on a quarterly basis. So if we get through 10 deposits or 20 deposits or 500 deposits, whatever it is, come to the Board of Public Works, make those recommendations, establish that nexus relationship, and then propose to use those funds for investment. So if there are projects during any fiscal year that can use the money at that point in time, then that would be the recommendation. Alternatively, if we time it correctly with the budget proposal and also the development of the mayor's budget, ultimately your budget as well, then City Council could then include those potential revenues as a funding source.
You're not going to limit it to the budget process. It'll be on an as-needed basis.
I agree. It would be both sides. So we would try to synchronize as much as we can with the budget, but my position would be move it forward as quickly as possible. So as soon as we make that determination that there is a nexus relationship and that we can use those monies to invest and fund public projects, that we move forward with it as quickly as possible. Ideally, if I had enough staff, monthly would be nice, but I think quarterly right now is a good commitment.
Okay. Appreciate that. And is the board currently considering new lending guidelines for the trust fund? And if so, what's the anticipated timeline in terms of bringing those forward?
So we are definitely considering multiple guidelines and policies. For example, there is a recommendation for the annual report in fiscal year 2016 that is recommending to assess an interest to those that are borrowing from the fund. So just to be very clear, the board has authorized and the City Council has concurred with authorizing $36 million of that $124 million to be lent out. That has already been approved. Those funds or those borrowers that we transfer those monies to, if they earn interest on that money and that interest does not go back to the general fund, we are recommending that we charge the interest that we would have earned if we had kept the money in the Public Works Trust Fund so that they would reimburse that money back. The CAO's report that's before you counteracts that and indicates that we are charging interest on all loans, and that is not an accurate statement. We're only charging interest on loans that are going to a fund that earns its own interest and keeps its own interest. If it's going to another fund that earns its own interest, but that interest goes to the general fund, we are not charging interest on that because ultimately whatever we earn in the Public Works Trust Fund, which is approximately about $1 million a year, that money gets transferred to the general fund. Then your council decides how to spend that money.
Colleagues? Go ahead. Mr. Vizcaino?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I want to recognize Dr. Campos for his leadership and guidance. If it wasn't for your guidance and pushing for this Nexus study, we wouldn't have these dollars before us. And Ms. Bronner, thank you for your report as well. We met during the National League of Cities last fall, and I know municipalities across the country are leaning to people like yourself who are looking at good governance and efficiencies. I want to point your direction to attachment B. You'll see the council district viewpoint by purpose in council district. You'll see a figure of $84,141, and it appears that this was already allocated in the 18-19 budget. How are you going to ensure that these dollars are split evenly amongst the council districts?
So excellent question. I'm going to move forward with the presentation because there is a handout that splits up this money. So the Bronner Group provided us of where that $5.9 million would be by council district. There's a slide in the presentation that actually divides it up by council district and by purpose as well. So if you can go forward to the next slide. One more, please. One more. I think this is what you're referring to, yeah. Councilman, in terms of where the money is. So this is the fun part, right? So the hard part was trying to find the money and trying to establish the nexus. The fun part is knowing how much you have. Then there's another difficult part is how you spend the money. So overall, there's $5.9 million that is being proposed before you to be invested into Public Works Trust Fund. As the Bronner Group suggested and the policies being considered, those funds do have limitations, and we are making those limitations based on the nexus relationship, whether it's by specific location or by specific purpose. Overall, there's about $74,000 for general improvement. The bulk of the money, it's about $4 million for street improvement, and then we have about $407,000 that are going to be used for specific purposes such as sidewalk repairs, street lighting, tree planting, or any type of traffic or route studies. And then there's also a pocket of money which is $487,000, which is policy option A, that gives you the flexibility to use it for anything that you'd like. In that respect, for that policy option A, 487, the proposal to the Board of Public Works was to use that money to fund the position that is being proposed in the Board of Public Works report. After the presentation to the Board of Public Works, the commissioners decided to only allocate about $75,000 for the position to fund the first year of the position, and then give the remaining amount back to the council districts so that you can decide how you spend that. They put a parameter and they suggested a parameter, and this is a very healthy discussion that the Board of Public Works went through in terms of how do we distribute that $412,000. So we started with $487 minus the $75,000 for the senior management analyst position. That left us about $412,000 to be used at your discretion. From there, the Board of Public Works decided whether they should split it up among the bottom two council districts, which would be districts 8 and 9. They also discussed about the bottom 4 districts, which would be 7, 8, and 9, and 10. And they also discussed about the bottom 6 districts. They remained silent in terms of how you should distribute it. They just said that it ought to be the discretion of the council in terms of how you distribute it. So if you were to go with option number 1 and just look at the 412 and equally distribute it among the bottom 4, which is what the Board of Public Works recommended, their recommendation is to, if you do equal distribution, that would mean that the bottom 4 council districts would get about $103,000 in additional funding. So that would be 7, 8, 9, and 10 again. The other option that you can decide is you can bring 8 and 9 up to par with the rest, so that would bring them about $100,000 minimum funding, and then split equally among the bottom 4 the remaining amounts. So for example, 8 and 9 has about $1,000 and $7,000. We would bring them up to $100,000 just to equal the playing field, if you will, or bring them a little bit more so that they can actually do a project with $100,000. Then the remaining amount, which would be about $219,000, divide that into the bottom 4, which would give everyone about $54,000 or $55,000 additional funding. When you do that, then the bottom 5 and 6 now becomes disproportionate, and they receive a little bit less because now you have $150,000, $160,000 to the bottom 4 districts. That leaves Council District 3 and also Council District 13 vulnerable to receiving less funds when you equally distribute. So the other option that the Board of Public Works considered was equally distributing among the bottom 6. And if you do the bottom 6 equal distribution, that's about $68,000 that's going to be distributed among the bottom 6. Or if you bring the first 2, which would be 8 and 9, to $100,000, then distribute the remaining $219,000 among the bottom 6. That would be about $36,000. So again, you have the option of distributing among the bottom 4 or the bottom 6. That is something that we will leave up to your discretion to
Which
decide.
way do you think is the most equitable?
I
If we
think
wanted
that
your recommendation.
once you do the math and you start looking at distribution among the bottom 4, then that would basically bring 3 and 13 out of place in terms of the funding. So my recommendation would be to distribute among the bottom 6, spread the money a little bit more throughout the entire districts or half the council districts.
So I have a money question if I can, Mr. Chair. Anyone here representing the CAO, please come forward. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Raha Zamir from Office of CAO.
So as it relates to the budget in preparation for the 18-19 budget, the allocation of the Public Works Trust Fund dollars to the pavement preservation program appears in the footnote of the 18-19 budget and doesn't appear in the street services budget or the pavement preservation schedule. Do we know why is that?
It was in the closing days of budget, and we're trying to close the budget, so it was dealing with technicalities with the back and forth with the mayor's office. That was the easiest way of dealing with it.
So it's fast moving, you guys had to get
Yes.
the budget out, and that's why it appeared on
Yes.
the footnote. So the Nexus study revealed that specifically to CD15, over $1 million from projects in my district, most of that went to pavement preservation, and it's already allocated in the 18-19 budget. So I'm told that we saved the general fund dollars, and I think this is true for most of the dollars that were for the council districts in the study. So I feel that we're not actually gaining anything extra despite having uncovered all this extra money. Can you touch on that for me?
As I mentioned, it was for closing the budget, so the shortfall in the general fund that we had, we exchanged this funding for the general fund shortfall that we had, and that's why we used it for pavement preservation.
So I'd just like to see, Mr. Chair, on if you look at the projects before 1989 that are more flexible to the Mitigation Fee Act, how can we differentiate attachment A and B, which of those dollars are pre-1989? I'd like to ask for future reports if this is clear in the table, which the dollars are pre-89 or versus more flexible dollars that we can use in the long haul to preserve our streets. I'd also like to hear from both the CAO and the Board of Public Works on how to best use $100,000 to finish the Nexus study. I know there's a discrepancy between the CAO and the recommendation from the Board of Public Works. I just scratching my head why such a strong difference in opinion.
For us, Mr. Councilman, is the legality of it, because the city policy is against using the one-time revenue for ongoing expenses, and since having one person as a position that would take care of this on ongoing basis is an ongoing expense, we're not recommending using this one-time revenue for that. So we think that you see necessary to have that position, we have to deal with it through the budget basis, and we
So
go
this
through
is
that.
going to be a recurring ask, Mr.
Yes.
Campos, on
Yes.
how to fund this position moving forward. And the PAWC committee recommended.
Absolutely. We don't think this is one time. We're completely on polar opposites, and we respect the CAO's opinion in terms of funding this.
Yeah.
But from what I've been looking at over the last 2 years, this is a constant need. We've had this trust fund for about 70 years. Deposits are coming in. We collect about $40-50 million. We transfer out another $20-30 million, and we're doing this with the resources that we currently have. What I would invite you to envision is what would we be able to do if we had more resources dedicated to this function. This function is not only a revenue generating, but also revenue seeking. So these monies are available for the council district. It's for the city. It's for the investment to make the city great and livable and improve our infrastructure. So for me, from the Board of Public Works, it would be a recurring ask. It's not going to go away. There's some stewardship that needs to be put in place. There's active financial management that needs to be put in place. There's accountability issues. There's responsibility issues to our depositors. So again, Councilman, it would be a recurring issue, a recurring request for us. So we don't believe it's one time.
Just one more point that I wanted to bring to your attention. Since the Public Works Trust Fund was funded in 1940s, only $12 million has been collected in this special fund that we can use for our public and like CIP capital use. So we're not looking at millions of dollars each year, even though we're receiving a lot more from guarantors and depositors in this fund, but we're not really looking at a huge source of fund, a revenue for our city. So we're not really sure if spending all that money would generate the revenue that we think it would.
I'm still struggling, though, if you can just address this on, and I know you mentioned you guys were scrambling, you added a footnote. The council already appropriated the general fund money to support pavement preservation. And the footnote, again, authorizes street services to reimburse the general fund up to $3.2 million. So where does that $3.2 million of freed up general fund go to?
It was the $3.2 million that was allocated in the beginning of the budget process for pavement preservation. By bringing this $3.2 million from Board of Public Works Trust Fund, we were able to free that $3.2 million from general fund. So the general fund would be reimbursed by this money as the work
again,
gets
it's
done
just moving dollars from
Yes.
table A to table B.
Yes.
Got it. Right. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thanks. And I know we have a lot on the agenda, but Ms. Martinez, next.
I just have one question. Maybe Mr. Campos, I don't know if this is for you, but how many deposits or funds are you going to still be looking at studying? Do you have an amount?
We'd like to look at all deposits. We have about 12,500. We know that the 12,500 deposits. We know that 206 of those deposits are not applicable to the MFA. I would assume that the other 300 or so that are in this one account of 29 accounts will not be applicable also, but we have to go through all the other 28 accounts. We would have to go through and apply a test to see whether it does apply or not. So I'm thinking overall, I would say a good 2,000 to 3,000 deposits will probably be the ones that we'll have to go into.
We can continue to replenish the fund.
Correct.
And will we be using the same consultant to look? Is this a study separate and aside from this one, or we would have to start the process again?
No, we would actually, our recommendation is to actually retain and in-source a position by the senior man in my office so that we would have a dedicated full-time resource.
That was going to be my next question, is are you going to be able to handle the workload to go through these many deposits?
I think to begin, the senior management analyst position would be good as we explore and we define whether the MFA is applicable to the rest of the accounts and to determine the level of detail that we have to go in through the fund management. Then we can decide whether we need additional resources. But at this point, just to kick it off and launch this, the process, one position would be good. I'm going to be very conservative and I'm not going to recommend 6 or 7 positions. I think 1 or 2 may be a good number for fund management. Again, it's only one trust fund of 209 funds that I have under my oversight. The Nexus Study is only one of 29 accounts within that one account. So it's a lot larger than just the special account, and that's the point that I'm trying to deliver here. The CAO's office is looking at it as one account, one time review. I'm seeing it as a long term. It's not going away anytime soon.
Okay. And then my final question, Mr. Chair, is you talked a little bit about the interest earned by the trust fund. Do we know what that amount is? How much interest has been earned so far, and where is it going?
We earn about $1 million per year, and
you
that
did
money goes to the general fund.
And that's what you, so I just want to go back and explain again how you would go ahead and charge back the interest as opposed to it going back to the general fund?
If the policy had been placed to charge interest on those borrowers that keep their own interest, that would amount to about $300,000 a year in lost revenue for the general fund. As of last year, the board adopted the policy, so we are now starting to charge interest. And this is the recommendation that the CAO's office is not concurring with us. They're saying, do not charge that interest. They believe that it's interest that is being earned is not reimbursable because of grants. So first off, if there is a grant and it's going to a general fund funded account, if it's going to an account that earns interest and that interest goes to the general fund, we're not even charging interest. So I would say 80-90% of all the loans fall into that category. So it's only a small percentage of those loans that do keep their interest. But when they do keep their interest, for example, we have an outstanding loan for $10 million at the CAO's office for seismic bond. If we had charged interest on that $10 million over the last 10 years, we would have been able to recoup that money. That seismic bond program has been able to retain that interest earned and reinvest it for the seismic bond program. So we are recommending that we charge that interest that the Public Works Trust Fund would have earned and turn it over to the general fund, not allow them to keep.
And that's what the Board of Public Works approved?
That's what we're recommending, and that's what the Board of Public Works approved.
Got it. I concur with you. Did you want to say something?
That a specific $10 million loan to Office of CAO for seismic bond is a revolving fund. So the balance on this account, we are front funding the grants, and as we receive the grant funding, we go ahead with next projects. So the balance on that account is very low. It's only in few hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we checked with Office of Accounting and we checked with Office of Finance. That account does not receive any interest. It's not accruing any interest, and it's not if there would be any interest, then we would agree with that recommendation. But overall, on that $36 million loans overall from that Board of Public Works Trust Fund, there is not much that would earn its own interest and keep interest. And that $10 million has just been, I think, a miscommunication between two parties. We're not receiving any interest out of that fund. It's a revolving fund.
Ms. Rodriguez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Campos, and perhaps, broader, I just have a quick question. In terms of the workflow, because I know you indicated that what created some of the circumstances that we were experiencing in Digging Deep is because of the circumstances with the workflow of how these are processed, but more importantly, the lack of documentation. How has that process, there have been recommendations for correcting that those protocols, and have they begun implementation, given that you still have so many accounts to still 12,000 to dig into, but it's going to be an ongoing incurring growth given the amount of activity that will continue even through the course of you investigating how you're going.
There's definitely areas of weaknesses, and some of them are highlighted in the Bronner Group's report to us. So as of right now, there has not been any changes, but we do want to make those changes, such as asking for more documentation when we are setting up the accounts, making sure that the clerks or the individuals that are receiving the monies, that we're checking off whether it's a MFA or not MFA, whether it's development project, whether it's a planning project. So we need those types of level of details, plus the documentation that goes with it. Since some of these funds are about 20 years old, 15 to 20 years old, the documentation is just not there. So the Bronner Group was able to look at the low-hanging fruit, if you will. The remaining balance, which is about $6 million, those are the ones where we have the lack of documentation. So we have to scrub those accounts. We have to connect the dots. We have to do some forensic auditing and some forensic accounting so that we can move forward with the use of those funds. So it's going to take a lot more effort, I would say moderate to advanced or moderate to extensive research for the remaining accounts within this one account. So to answer your question, Councilwoman, we have not made any changes to we are looking at making those changes. Now that we have some rubrics, now we have some guidance, we now know that the MFA does not apply for this account, but it could apply to other accounts. So we're trying to make those rules and policies, which is before you, that the board has already adopted. Once we establish those rules and policies, then it would give us a nice guidance and good parameters to move forward to implementing improvements in the future.
Okay. Because obviously that would be, I think, one of the more immediate courses of action just to help protect the revenue that's going to be generated going forward. But just going back to those accounts that were reimbursed, for example, that were not eligible for us to retain, how vulnerable are we for the remaining accounts that exist, and it's roughly nearly $6 million, correct, that could potentially be reimbursed? I mean, or how much of a without knowing those accounts.
Without knowing the details and without
Right.
looking at the deposits and the backup documentation, I would be comfortable saying 60 to 70% we're okay because
Okay.
the MFA doesn't apply. As long as there's a nexus, there's going to be some deposits that will have to be reimbursed. So if I had
Because
to...
we're talking about $30,000 among 132 accounts, correct?
Correct.
So just trying to get a sense of what potentially we could be subject to given
Right.
whatever might come next with the balance of...
So we think that once we start looking at the remaining accounts and in that one account, that we'll come up with the same conclusions and same recommendations that the Bronner Group has made to us. But we don't know until we start looking into that.
Thank you.
Mr. Rue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and great job on taking the initiative for this Nexus study, and I really want to thank the Bonner Group too. This was a great report. But the current Nexus study, it's only half done, right, with the current accounts? About 40, is it 49% or 51% of the accounts have been
50%,
evaluated?
A little under 50%, yes.
So we should be seeing, once the whole Nexus, once all the accounts are evaluated, we'll probably see the same amount, roughly, hopefully.
I'm going to be conservative and say maybe 60 to 70% of that $6 million. It may end up being closer to the $6 million, but I just don't know. I think these are going to be more difficult accounts to prove that there's a nexus, but we will.
But bottom line, we're going to see more money, so
I think they're going to
that's
see
a good thing.
millions of dollars, yes.
Yeah. So what's your recommendation on, especially for the unknown amounts, the 421,000 or something like that? Do we wait till the entire study's done, or because whatever we come up with now, once the next 51% is evaluated, it's probably going to be another.
Yeah, the recommendation on the 487,000 is what you have available now.
Mm-hmm.
The remaining balance that we will look at, which is the $6 million, that may turn up another several $100,000. Mm-hmm. We don't know. Once we start looking into that, we may have an additional management or funds that we can use at our discretion. So it would be in addition to the 487. My recommendation for the 487 is to take some of that money, fund the position that we need to keep this project moving forward. If the position doesn't get funded or approved, then basically you get the $6 million, then we stop production or delay production.
No, I support the position. And so how long will it take for the rest of the Nexus study to be completed?
I'm estimating about 18 to 24 months in total.
Again, I'm fully supportive of funding the position at Public Works, but CAO also noted that there's an existing accounting position within the Board of Public Works that's recently been vacated. What's the difference between that job position versus the one that you're requesting now?
So I'll let the CAO's office make comments on my operations, but there is an account. We do have a senior management analyst that's dedicated to our budget development process, and that position just recently became vacated. That position not only does our CPRA requests, but does our metrics, does our accounting function. These are the individuals that make sure that the payments are being made to the contractors. So we do have a policy of making payments within 30 days, 100% of those invoices being paid within 30 days. We're approximately 94, 95% within 30 days. So that position is dedicated to not only track and monitor, but also making sure that the our contractors are getting paid. So I think having that position absorb this work is not reasonable. Having that position take over this work and not having the other contractors paid, I think it would be a big disservice to the city residents. But again, I'll let the CAO's office comment on my operations.
Great. For going to the Nexus study, 600. I'm excited that for Council District 4, they found $653,000 available for a variety of public works projects. But there was a $428,000 project for the bulkhead repair on Verde Oak Drive. I was wondering how and when was this project identified?
You want to take that one? Budget.
Sir, that project was referred during the budget process to us from Bureau of Engineering. It is from the list of projects that Bureau of Engineering keeps, and they rank and score them based on the necessity and the risk for the public risk that each project has. And since we had some sort of funding to be able to do that, they also mentioned that the road was subsided about 2 feet, and it was a serious public risk, and we could fund it. It was in the list of Bureau of Engineering for a few years, and we could find the funding for it, so we went ahead with it.
So BOE has a list of projects with, I guess, high priority projects with what is dangerous, and that's how this was pulled out of that.
So it was referred to us by the Bureau of Engineering for CIP projects.
So where are you in the process of that bulkhead repair on Verde Oak Drive for 428?
That has been bid. I think it's out for bid, and the bid is supposed to be received by 21st of August this year.
So, and that was decided when?
It was during the budget process.
During budget process.
18-19 budget process, yes.
Right. So, and you know, it's my understanding that this project was identified in 2013.
Yes.
By the previous council office. And I do concur, I mean, it's from the description of it, it looks like it is a destabilized hillside, and the roadway has decreased by 2 feet, but it's basically taken 5 years for BOE or for all the departments to identify funding for this project.
That is one possibility. The other possibility is maybe the condition of the road changed and the project moved in a scoring in the list of the BOE.
So my concern is, I mean, I have a whole list of bulkheads, streets. I just met with constituents who's requested 10 years ago to the previous council office on Parkview, Pacific View Drive for a bulkhead and street repair. And I had to appease them because we have no money to fix that. So and we just recently found out about this. And I really think there's a huge transparency issue here, because I would have loved to have been involved in the decision of spending $428,000 on emergency projects, because I could give you tons of it. So I'm very concerned.
I'm sure that our office is more than welcome to have a meeting separate on this with you, sir, and consult with you any projects that you might have, or in the next set of projects that we want to consider, or even exchange of funds with like different projects that you have. I know that there is another project for CD4.
Right, because even during the budget deliberation, this was never brought to our office to even consider, and now it seems like it's far off in the RFP process. So it's not like, and there was no calls whatsoever to my office, even from the community.
Councilmember, I'm David Hirano with the Office of the CAO. First of all, I apologize that you feel like your office wasn't notified during the budget process. Those projects were listed in the project listing in the CIP and the mayor's proposed budget. So they were there for inspection. If you would like us in the future to make a stop in with your office when those lists are released and have a conversation with you, we can definitely do that. And what she was also saying was we could also sit down and work with your staff and resort through the priorities for projects in your district and look at what funding is available and see how we can help.
So let me clarify. Yes, it was on the list, but never were we notified that we actually had some monies available to prioritize, because we would have loved in working with that priority list to figure out which projects should be served. So, Mr. Chair, with your approval, I'd like to ask the CAO and the BOE to report back to this committee, and it seems like BOE already has this list, so it shouldn't be a problem. Report back to this committee with the list of all approved capital projects improvements, those in pre-design and post-design by council district that are in the Bureau's queue. And I'd also like to have those projects prioritized by the level of hazard that they present.
Well, without objection, I'm happy to include that in the recommendations. And if I'd like to land this plane, I'll offer a few other recommendations so we can move to other items. So we'll include that as the first recommendation. Also, as I mentioned earlier about Mr. Koretz and the pause committee, we're going to honor that request for the position. So I want to make the following recommendations: that we adopt recommendations 1, 5, 7, and 8 in the CAO's June 15th, 2018 report. We authorize the Board of Public Works Director of Accounting to transfer funds consistent with the Mayor and Council actions on this matter, subject to the approval of the CAO, and request of the Controller to implement these instructions with the following amendments. Authorize the distribution of $321,409 in the unknown council district pursuant to Dr. Campos' suggestion among the 6 council districts with the lowest allocation amounts. Replace the $100,000 item entitled BPW Contractual Services in the Council District Unknown category with a new $75,000 line item entitled BPW Salaries General for 9 months funding of a Senior Management Analyst 1 at the Board of Public Works to assist in the management of the Public Works Trust Fund. Reduce the pavement preservation line item in the Council District 2 category by $292,000. 3, authorize resolution authority for 1 Senior Management Analyst 1, Class Code 9171-1 at the Board of Public Works to assist in the management of the Public Works Trust Fund. And finally, 4, to instruct the CAO, actually not finally, the CAO to prepare and transmit the necessary controller instructions to the City Clerk prior to Council's consideration of this matter to effectuate the intent of these instructions. And Mr. Buscaino, did you have a report back as well? You wanted in the record something about the pre-89 funds? If you could state that recommendation clearly for our adoption as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask that in future reports it's clear in the table which of the dollars are pre-89 or more flexible dollars, if I can.
Okay, so that
pre-89 to more flexible.
We'll ask a report back for that as well. Without objection, it is so ordered, and we will move on to the next item. No objections? Great.
And Mr. Chair, this is all for item number 2, correct?
We took up items 1 and 2 together.
And for item number 1, are there separate recommendations? Will we be considering the CAO recommendations for item number 1 as written, or?
Yeah, as I started out, I said adopt recommendations 1, 5, 7, and 8 in the CAO's report.
I believe that's for item number 2.
I thought that was item 1. Recommendation, the next study, recommendations item 2. Let me clarify that. Is there?
So just to clarify, item number 1 is the financial status report for fiscal year 16 and 17. The fiscal year 17 is just a receive and file, so there's no action other than receiving it. The 2016 report is where the Board of Public Works is recommending to assess an interest. The CAO's office is recommending not to assess that interest, and also instructing the Office of Finance to create an account for the interest earned that are subject to the Mitigation Fee Act. So there's 5 separate recommendations on the CAO's report.
For item number 1.
For item number 1.
Item number 1.
The 8 recommendations that you read are for item number 2.
Right. So basically, all of that except for item 2. So we're going to adopt the recommendations for number 1. Adopt the recommendations in the CAO report relative to the financial status of the Public Works Trust Fund, number 834 for fiscal years ending June 30, 2016, and June 30, 2017. All except for number 2. Okay? Clear? Good. All right, it is so approved. We'll move on then to item number 3. And Mr. Espinosa, if you could read that item into the record.
Item number 3 are reports from the Los Angeles Department of Transportation relative to Dockless on-demand personal mobility services and recommended rules and guidelines. This was also referred to the Transportation Committee.
Great, and we'll start with, we have a number of public comment cards on this, and we'll start with public comment. Mr. Sam Dreeman, followed by Joseph Conti. Each get 1 minute.
Good afternoon, Public Works Committee. My name is Sam Dryman. I'm the Director of Strategic Development and Government Affairs for Lime, Dockless bike share and scooter share company. Just wanted to express our incredible support for the pilot program regulations that LADOT has prepared. We've been working very closely with them on providing feedback to make sure that the issues that many of the council and community is concerned about, including safety and enforcement, are taken into consideration, and how we can also improve the operations and technology from our side to ensure those concerns are addressed. And we are also working closely with all the council members and their offices to ensure we are aware of the concerns in those particular communities and how we can address them when the pilot program rolls out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dryman. Next, Mr. Conti, followed by Shane Phillips.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Joseph Conti, and I'm an operations manager at Lyft. Our Lyft hub is located here in the Arts District and has approximately 100 plus employees. Lyft is very excited about the City Council's progress in crafting rules and regulations for dockless, on-demand, shared mobility devices. We look forward to remaining a responsible partner with the city and hope these devices have a lasting and positive impact on the city. With regard to policy at this point, we have a concern related to an addition made during the Transportation Committee meeting last week. Specifically, we think that limiting conditional use permits to select businesses creates an unfair advantages for these businesses. We ask that this committee and the full council consider allowing interested businesses to apply for conditional use permits regardless of fleet status or size as of August 1st, and grant permits based on the merits of the application. So, sincere thanks from the entire Lyft team, and we look forward to engaging with the City Council throughout this process and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Shane Phillips, followed by Russell Howes.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Shane Phillips with Central City Association. We're excited here in downtown to welcome dockless vehicles, and we're hoping that you can move this pilot forward as quickly as possible. I've ridden the scooters on a few occasions personally, and based on that experience, I'm a little concerned about the proposed speed reduction and how it will interact with the city's varied topography. I know, so in my experience, riding it on the Spring Street Bridge over the LA River, I've seen the scooters at even their current speed limit really noticeably slow down on pretty modest hills. And my understanding of how these devices, speed caps work, is that they actually limit motor power to indirectly limit speed. And so that in hillier areas or where you have heavier riders, the speed may actually be effectively quite a bit below 12 miles per hour. We're aware that the scooters have been most active in coastal communities up to this point, but we want to be sure that the rules designed based on the experience there don't make the service unusable in urban neighbors like downtown. So we ask that you consider working with the operators to study how that speed cap will actually work in practice. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Russell Howes, followed by Alex Nessick.
Hi. I appreciate the efforts of the council and LADOT to deal with the issue of scooter parking, but the current regulations proposed by LADOT do not sufficiently address traffic safety. They will not reduce the severe safety risk to pedestrians and cyclists caused by these scooters. Although traffic safety was not addressed in the initial motion, they need to be amended, the regulations need to be amended, and should not be approved until they address pedestrian and cyclist safety by taking appropriate steps to ensure enforcement of existing laws. If traffic safety provisions are not included in the regulations before they're approved, it's unlikely they will be added until something drastic happens, like a class action lawsuit. Until this happens, LADOT should not be authorized to approve any companies to operate in the city. I live in Mar Vista, I work in Venice, and I see these scooters all over the place. I ride them, I like riding them, it's fun. It gets me where I need to go. Almost every time I cycle or exercise on the beach, I see a bird rider causing an accident with a cyclist, pedestrian, or another scooter. I've seen injuries requiring ambulances. I missed what Councilmember Koretz had to say at the top of the meeting, but I heard his concern with the inability of Bird and Lime to provide a service that complies with existing laws. I think his concerns about legality of scooters on streets can and will be overcome with legislation, but setting aside that concern, in Mar Vista and Venice, there is a complete failure to enforce the safety laws mentioned in the draft regulations.
The time's up to finish up.
I thought I had 2 minutes.
It was each one is getting 1 minute, but you can finish your thoughts.
Okay, sure. I definitely have a lot more to say, but LAPD West Traffic does not have the manpower, and Bird and Lime need to be responsible for enforcing the traffic safety laws. If they can't do that, if they can't come up with technology, they shouldn't be allowed to operate in the streets because the safety risk is too high.
Thank you very much. Alex Nessick, followed by Eric Eid, or ID.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Alex Nessick with Clever Mobility. I submitted a letter to the committee And just following up on that, we're firm believers in LEVs, intelligent LEVs, as part of the solution to first mile, last mile transportation, as an extension of public transit, because it fills a lot of gaps, and as an alternative to automobiles. However, we strongly believe that it should be done intelligently and with the least amount of disruption to municipalities and their residents, as Councilmember Koretz was alluding to. While the proposed Dockless rules and mobility data specification are a good start, we're advocating that operators use technology to make regulatory compliance proactive rather than a public enforcement issue. Specifically, enhanced GPS with accuracy inside of 3 feet enables capabilities like geofencing of designated areas in real time by network communication with vehicles, limiting top speeds or entirely disabling devices on sidewalks or other restricted areas, accurately managing designated parking zones, and more. The city should refrain from allowing operators to deploy devices with mediocre GPS tracking capabilities on the order of 30 to 100 feet accuracy with no ability to manage them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Eric Eady, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, followed by Jed Powker.
My name is Eric Eady. I'm Director of Government Affairs for Bird Scooters. Good afternoon. I want to thank Councilman Maru for proposing this ordinance and thank Chair Blumenfield for seconding it. We agree with Councilmember Koretz's point that we need to have strong education and enforcement in this new space, and that's why Bird has really taken a number of steps that I could detail if we have time, of steps we've already taken to improve safety. We also support law enforcement's power to enforce the rules of the road. I did want to talk a little bit about, if I could for just a moment, about the proposed 12 mile per hour speed limit that's proposed by the Transportation Committee. We believe that speed should be regulated. That's why we proactively govern that speed at 15 miles per hour. And based on our research, that is the average speed of a bicycle. I wanted to differentiate between top speed and average speed. The current regulations call out governing 12 miles per hour as the top speed, but some research suggests that 12 miles per hour might actually just be the average speed, so it introduces new complexity and unintended potential consequences. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And last, public speaker Jed Powker.
Thank you. Please refer to page 4 and 5 of the handout that Mr. Espinoza may have given you. It depicts pictures that show some of the safety and regulatory challenges that Mr. Koretz described today. Russell Howe already discussed some of the safety and regulatory issues in his comment here on the gentleman from Clever. Already told you what I was going to tell you, which is that the companies can do this. They can self-regulate with all the software that they need to do it and prevent the violations before they happen. Automotive companies were forced to after many years to regulate with seat belts, etc., mirrors. There are standards on all of those. You can do it too with these vehicles. We have a great opportunity to make this actually work. Unfortunately, you're just going to have to force the card and make it happen. You may be aware of Santa Monica's newly released report relating to its pilot program. I strongly recommend that you take a look at it and have your staff review it before making any decision on 171125. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. I'd like to ask Marcel Porras from the Department of Transportation to come forward. Mr. Porras, if you could run us through the proposed guidelines with an emphasis on the enforcement. Well, we have the purview of everything, the enforcement piece in particular, and then we'll also have someone from sanitation come forward as well after you're done.
Sure. Marcel Porras, Chief Sustainability Officer at LADOT. So just really broadly, before you is a proposed permitting program for dockless on-demand mobility that would both cover both non-electric and electric scooters and bicycles in the city of Los Angeles, up to a potential cap of 10,500 vehicles per company. Overall, the program is embedded into the application is an outreach component, an equity component. There is findings and work done around safety requirements for the vehicles themselves. There's acknowledgement to California Vehicle Code requirements in terms of where the vehicles can actually reside and be operated. In terms of one of the key things for this program and LADOT's role in the program is how do we actually create a program that we can manage and grow over time? Because that is one of the things that we've seen the explosion here in Los Angeles and across the country. And I think there is a pent-up demand for these new mobility devices, but we have to do it in a way that's responsible and that allows us to scale them effectively. And I think fundamental to that is the ability to receive data in real time from these companies so that we can continue to scale. I think in conversations that we've had with the city family, Bureau of Street Services, Bureau of Sanitation, LAPD, we cannot hire enough people fast enough to manage this a large program of the scale that we would like to go. I think we've heard from several council offices that they can't wait for it to come to their district, but currently we have a cap that we're proposing because initially we want to understand and manage these companies and the data flows that we're going to start receiving. We've been working closely with ITA and with internal LADOT staff to build the architecture to be able to receive the data in real time so that we can do that evaluation in order to scale. We have tools at our disposal now that are tried and true, that are based off of relationships that we as a department have and roles and responsibilities that city departments have here. So in terms of on the enforcement piece of this program, it's going to, first off, require data flowing through to the department of where the vehicles are in real time so that we can understand where they're being concentrated, if they're not being moved for 24 hours, if they're in a lake, et cetera. I mean, things just common sense. And we're going to require that the companies themselves be the first line of defense to adjust and address issues that arise from the poor parking jobs or the damaged vehicles themselves. And so that feedback loop would go specifically to each of those companies. We've had conversations with ITA and 311 and are down the path of looking at what it would look like to actually have a dashboard for our 311 operators to be able to log in and create tickets for complaints. The other part of that is going to need to be engaging with the companies themselves so that they're understanding their role in closing out those tickets as well. I think in the most egregious manners, if there is someone who ends up being a bad operator, and that is going to need to be eyes and ears, working with the council office, working with LADOT writ large, but sanitation does have the ability to impound and confiscate vehicles, and that would be something that we would work closely with them hand in hand to do that if it were to get to that point. But ultimately, it would need to. We are putting the responsibility back for proper parking and operations of the vehicles on the operators themselves.
Great, thank you. And before we move to questions, maybe we'll have Mr. Lee of the Bureau of Sanitation describe their role in enforcement. A lot of the questions are going to be about how this all interacts. So thank you for that initial presentation. Stand by for questions.
Good afternoon, board members. On the enforcement portion of it, when a call has been vetted and given to LA San, we'll send out either a supervisor or a designee to go field check the location. Just like with our SR calls, we'll take a photo of before and after. So if we're confiscating a scooter, we'll take a before picture and after, upload it onto the SR. On the enforcement component, we have 6 districts, so we'll use maintenance laborers out of all 6 districts because it would not make sense to have a central yard at Washington and we're covering the valley, the harbor. So any scooters that are confiscated in East Valley, West Valley will be at that district.
And when what are you confiscating? Ones that have been blocking sidewalks or what?
Yeah, anything that all calls will go through DOT first. DOT will vet the calls, make sure if the vendors have taken care of removing them, if it's been sitting for 24 hours, blocking access. Once the call gets to us through DOT, then we'll send out our team to go field check, and if we have to confiscate it, we'll confiscate it at that time.
So how long does that process take?
Well, they're going to have 2 hours to remove the problem, and we've been discussing now what our hours are going to be. It's ongoing discussions within our bureau with the director, so everything hasn't been outlined exactly what our, because as you know, we're not 24/7, so at midnight we're not going to be able to dispatch a maintenance labor and a supervisor to go check on a scooter, so this is logistics we're currently working on now.
And then in terms of the other enforcement issues, so DOT will be responsible for the fleet size, data sharing, those kinds of things, and then it's LAPD will be enforcing the traffic laws themselves, and is anyone else taking that responsibility, or we're relying on LAPD for that? It's just solely to LAPD. But Joe, you had a follow-up question on that? Go ahead.
Yeah. So DOT traffic officers don't have color of authority to cite moving vehicles, correct? Correct. So would that take a state law change? Okay. We can table that for later.
Okay, we'll work on that. Separate issue, I don't know if this is really for either you or maybe for the city attorney. There's this issue of liability, potential liability. I sit on the budget committee, and every week we see cases where the city is liable for trip and falls, for bicycle hitting a pothole. If a scooter hits a pothole, do we get sued, or does everyone gets sued? Is there any indemnity that we have for that when we get sued, when the scooter hits the pothole? And I'm particularly worried because the potholes, smaller wheels are going to be hitting these potholes, which means a pothole that certainly wouldn't damage a car and wouldn't stop a bicycle will, cause a scooter to do an endo potentially. So what happens in that case? And I know that the proposal as is has a liability provision in it, but the way I read it, it's not going to protect us, and I wanted to see if you read it the same way.
Yeah, this is Ted Jordan, Public Works General Counsel. There is an indemnification provision and insurance requirements in the proposal. So unless it falls into the carve-out in the indemnification, which is the city's act of negligence.
Unless it falls into what?
There's a carve-out for indemnification, which is typical, which is except for the act of negligence or willful misconduct of the city. If something does not fall within that carve-out, then there is an indemnification obligation. So we would look, when we get sued, not if, when, we would look to that indemnification.
But what about the pothole? Because someone will argue that we have been given notice of that pothole and we have not fixed it, or the curb that's not the appropriate size, or whatever, the innumerable things that are wrong with our streets. What's to prevent the scooter companies from turning around and saying, that's not our fault, it's your fault?
I have my colleague here who's our Transportation General Counsel.
Yes, we turned this over to our risk managers, both at DOT and at CAO's office, and they analyzed the issue. If you want legal advice, our office is happy to report back to you. I don't want to get into issues.
I guess it's not that I want legal advice. I'm assuming we're going to end up being sued. And so what I'm wondering is if the proposed fees that are currently involved, do they cover that potential exposure? I think the answer is probably no, but I wanted to ask it as a question, and then my follow-up question would be, is there a fee that we should add on that would go into a liability fund that would cover such exposure? Is that a possibility legally even to do such a thing?
We're actually looking at that issue now. The mayor's office had requested that we look at that issue, so the mayor's office.
Oh, probably after I asked them a question about it, but okay, no, I'm sure they came up with it.
So we were approached with that issue.
But that's great, and Well, because I'd like to see that. So maybe one of the, as I don't want to slow down this process, but as a report back, colleagues, I'm going to ask for that to be included in the report backs, because I would like to see as much indemnification as possible. And if we can't indemnify us, which I don't know that we can, that we at least put aside a dollar amount, percentage, that goes into, in my ideal fantasy, would go into a liability fund. And if we don't use up that liability fund, then it would go into preventing liability in the future, meaning enhancing the mobility network or those kinds of things. And these companies have paid for enhancements to the mobility networks in other cities, so I don't think it's unreasonable.
Or buying additional insurance that would cover the city through a fee. We're looking at all different aspects of it, so we can get back to you as soon as we analyze those issues.
Okay, and is it possible that we'll get something like that before this comes to council?
Yeah, I think we can do that before it comes to council.
Because I would love to have, I don't want to slow this down for that, but I do think it's important. So thank you for that. Another issue, although I actually have a lot of questions. I'm going to let my colleagues ask a few, and I'll come back to mine because I like to keep things moving. Mr. Rue, you were last time, so you're first this time. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to thank Salita, Marcel, and the Department of Transportation for working with my office to develop these rules and regulations before us. I also want to thank Councilmember Bonin and members of the Transportation Committee for their thoughtful input on the rules and regulations. And also, last but not least, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for seconding the motion that I introduced back in October 2017 that kicked off this process. And what we have before us today is it's whether you love or hate dockless bikes or scooters, it's here. And this pilot or this beginning is not just about how do we regulate this new emerging industry, but I think it's literally the very test of how we see its viability, whether it's going to even survive. I mean, this is a PR battle. This is a perception battle. And this is going to show whether this is going to become a scourge or a solution. And I believe this is going to be a solution. But we really need all the operators here who are present to help us get there. And it's not just about what the city's going to regulate, but also, as talked about, many of the independent providers and operators starting to self-regulate themselves, because this is literally an opportunity to show that this new industry could work. And especially when we always talk about the first and last mile problem. I mean, this is why I was so excited about this and championed it a year ago, whether it's dockless bikes, electric scooters, or even autonomous driving. We can't say we're going to solve the traffic problem unless we're willing to roll up our sleeves and try these things and try these new technologies that are not just coming 5 or 10 years from now, but is already in existence. So I'm very excited about this. And we got to figure out, and I know one of our colleagues asked, this is not going to work, or how does it work? Well, and that's exactly what we're doing here. We don't know what's going to work or how it's going to work until we try it. And this is where we need to work together to make sure this gets developed. So I do have a few questions. The first question is, Marcel, I don't want you talked about the conditional permit process, and I don't want you to talk about that all over again. But in respects to when we adopt the regulations, you said we're going to cap the number of operators and vehicles in use. So to the various numbers that we ultimately decide on. But what I'm concerned about is during the 120 days for the pilot project, there are currently operators who are doing a pilot now or just operating without abiding by the rules. And there is also other providers who are actually abiding by the rules and waiting for the regulation to come in place. So if the existing vehicles or existing operators are already capped out, will that kind of penalize or punish those operators who are abiding by the law and who are waiting for the regulations?
For those companies that are not operating currently and will not be operating until the new permit is in place, then yes, they will not be able to operate until then under the current recommendation.
No. So what I'm saying is, so when we roll it out, there's already a couple of pilot projects that are going on in the city, as well as just operators just out there already. So will they, because if we do a cap, a 5,000 cap or 2,500 cap, and those vehicles are already out there, do they get a leg up advantage, is what I'm saying.
Well, I think they have a first mover advantage of being currently out in the city operating, yes.
So what I'm concerned about is there are some operators who are abiding by the rules and not putting any vehicles out there or any scooters out there. So what about those operators who are abiding by the rules and waiting? You understand what I'm trying to ask? So
yeah.
You got that, right? So so Marcel's exactly right. The ones who are out there operating, in absence of regulation, have a first mover advantage because they've been out there, they've established brand identity, they've established brand loyalty, although there's a fair amount of information out there that from a consumer perspective, when it comes to scooters, that's not a really powerful sort of motivator. They're going to pick the client's going to pick whatever scooter is closest at hand. So there's that advantage that they've had for being out there operating against the rules, and obviously there's some modest profits or money that's coming in from the use that they're getting, and the data is obviously valuable that they're gaining during that period between whenever the regs are finalized, whenever y'all direct us to go and sort of put together the permit program, and when the permit program launches. But once the permit program launches, there is not a cap on the number of operators. We could have, Santa Monica had 18 applications. We could decide to say yes to 18 operators in the city. Each one of them gets the same cap in terms of the total number of devices that they can have out on city streets, which is 3,000 base, and then on top of that,
2,500 and another 5,000.
All right, so you're talking about
10,500
per operator, so 18 times
So
10,000.
So the rollout is going to be, I guess, equitable, but do we want to, your recommendation, yeah, so do you want would it be wise or to give additional incentive or for those operators who are abiding by the rules right now waiting?
So there's obviously a couple different ways that we could handle that, right? We could offer additional, cap for people who wait for the full program. We could open conditional use permit more broadly. We could actually have an application-driven program for conditional use permit where we required proof of insurance and maybe a couple of other things, but keep the cap on the number of devices allowed under the conditional use permit fairly low, because what you lose if we do it that way is the outreach and the equity plans that each of the operators are going to be required to do as part of the full permit. So that would be what you would be sacrificing, but what you would be getting in exchange if we opened up conditional use permit more broadly is perhaps a leveling of the playing field for the short period of time between now and when we open the full program. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'd be interested in something like that possibly.
And Mr. Drew, and I certainly agree with you, another option we can consider, and I'll get your thoughts related to this, is if we opened it up to all folks for a conditional use permit, which I think we either go the direction, me personally, we either ban them all or we open it up to everyone. It seems like an unfair advantage to allow some companies that are just because they threw in early to get that conditional use versus others. But we could, and correct me if I'm wrong, we could put a cap on the conditional use permit so that even though the final cap for you said is 3,000, let's say, we could arbitrarily say during the conditional use process, the cap will be 1/2 of what you can ultimately go for in through the regulation process. So whether you're existing or you're a new entrant, as a conditional use for these months before we have the final regulation, we could say you only get up to 1,500 during that time period, and all comers are welcome, not just the ones who operated without permission. Does that sound equitable? Does that make sense to you?
That's certainly what we could certainly do something like that. And the downside is just that, you'd miss that outreach piece. that we're going to require as part of the full program, but it would be outreach to y'all and your constituents.
But
It's
would
really
the
up to y'all.
outreach piece still be there? Because the outreach piece would be for the full process. It would be.
Yes, they would. They would have to do, but I think there's an interest in, one, giving some coverage from a liability perspective immediately, because we know there's operators out there. And so
Right.
that was it's going to take the department some time and the company some time to assemble the process, do the outreach, put together the equity plan, et cetera. During that period, there's obviously a latent demand and a strong demand among the public to have these devices. And so that was the idea behind the conditional use permit, both meet the immediate demand, but also give the city some coverage from liability. Obviously not perfect, as you've articulated, but much better than what we have now, which is nothing. So if you're right, if there's an interest in opening up conditional use permit, we can do something that's very streamlined. But I would agree with your recommendation that it be for a smaller number of devices so that it's more manageable for DOT to
And
sort of
what do
deal
you
with.
think of the arbitrary, half?
It's as good a number as any.
Well, we're not deciding anything today, right?
Well, we would make a recommendation.
Right.
So
You
I
are.
would propose, if it sound, I'm getting the sense from the committee that we're all kind of on the similar page. Correct me if I'm wrong, which is there's an equity piece. We don't want to duly unfavor companies that have just been acting, but we want to keep the cap on it. So unless someone has a better number, I'm going to throw out half.
Well, do we need to? I mean, I don't want us to make a number on the fly. I mean, I think the bottom line is we want to make sure there's equity, and I want to make sure that those companies that have been holding back and waiting for the rules who've been abiding by all the rules, somehow we reward them, because otherwise everyone's just going to be like, you know what, we're just going to go out there now, right?
Right, which is the idea. But if we don't put a number on it, then the number is infinite for conditional use permits. So we either have to put the number that they're ultimately going to get, or we have to put, I would think, a smaller number per your, as you said. So
I would suggest that, because otherwise the difference is somewhat immaterial between a conditional use and full permit.
all right. So provisionally at the moment, unless we discuss it and come up with something else, we'll work toward a conditional use permit open to all comers that is a half the amount. So
The 3,000.
half of 3,000, so
Great.
1,500. Okay.
And you guys like that? Okay.
Okay, Mr. Rukin, I didn't mean to
So,
interrupt, but
no.
I
That's
saw
fine.
an opportunity to land that issue,
Okay,
and let's
all right.
land it and move forward.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for clarity's sake, the conditions of the conditional use permit will be sort of at the department's discretion. So we will keep them limited to the areas that I've already articulated. It's really about liability exposure and data that we want to get from them. But all the other pieces, the more robust application, we'll try and make it as streamlined and simple as possible.
We're going to let you figure those out.
Okay.
The data one, though, I was going to add that in, is extremely important because that's the game here. So I'm going to insist that that be one of them, but I think you're fine with that, right?
And on that data front, how often now and how often will the real-time and historical data being provided by the operators, will it be provided to the city? How often?
That's going to depend on the conversations with the company and where they're at right now. I think one of the first things that we want to do once we kick off the conditional permit is do a workshop with all of the companies. But we're looking to, as close as real time as possible, in as much as what the capacity that their vehicles have to transmit the data.
I don't know if you could answer this or the city attorney, but there's AB 2989 introduced by Assemblymember Flora, and it appears to be they're trying to water down the requirements for the use of helmets while operating a motorized scooter. And it looks like it's going to be passing unless you heard otherwise. That's why I want to ask. And with these agreements, and if it did pass, would this new bill indemnify the city if there's an accident of any kind?
I think that's more of a question for the city attorney.
Yes. Especially if if the scooter hits let me give a more concrete example, hits like a damaged sidewalk and a pothole. That's right, not a sidewalk, a pothole. I apologize. And that person was not wearing a helmet. So would our liability change if AB 2989 passed?
No, they don't address our our ability to require indemnity language in the permits. The only thing, having just analyzed the recent state amendment or Senate amendment, was that they were not going to require people over the age of 18 to wear helmets. But they didn't address
So
indemnity.
that, whether they wear a helmet or not, it's not going to affect us at all.
It shouldn't. It's not our responsibility. It's a state law. It's up to the state.
And so last question. There's a proposed cap on the speed limit for scooters reduced from 15 miles per hour to 12 miles per hour. I want to ask, is the 12 miles per hour any more or less enforceable than the 15 miles per hour cap? Are we going to use a radar gun?
My understanding is that there are speed governors that are placed on the vehicles that can govern the speed. And so I think that the companies will have to abide with whatever speed we place on them through the rules and guidelines. If they're found to be violating those, and I think the way we would determine is we would just spot check. We would spot check the vehicles, and if they show to be going in excess of the required speed limits, then I think that would be the enforcement piece. But it wouldn't be something that is happening in real time in terms of the enforcement. I think it would be spot check.
Spot check. And how much benefit does a speed reduction create compared to the regulatory and operational hurdles? Because if we did it at 12, and I believe Culver City is at 15, so besides spot checking, are we going to stand at the border and do they have to stop? Because if they're going 15 miles an hour in Culver City, so again, it's just a matter of spot checking.
Well, I think it's a matter of City of Los Angeles, like moving the market, right? I think we're going to have way more vehicles in our geography than anyone else in the county. And so it's going to depend on how we want, on what we want to set as those speed limits. I think that LA wants to be dictating what the speeds are and not relying on other smaller cities.
Just as a follow-up, could they geofence in some ways? And, when you enter Culver City, the governor allows you to go to 15. When you're in LA, the governor lowers you to 12.
How would it know that?
It's GPS. Yeah. Since she wasn't on the microphone, the General Manager of Transportation, Lita Reynolds, said yes, that these devices are smart enough, or the technology is there that they could do. The border could be controlled by satellites in the sky and the geofence and Star Wars and stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I have a couple of an amendment and instructions that I'd like to. Should I hold on to them or say them now?
You can hold on to the end unless you want to. You ask unless you want discussion on them, in which case you can raise them now.
Sure. I just wanted to amend the recommendation to include in the parking section on page 8 a requirement that dockless vehicles within 6 months come equipped with technology that would prevent operators from ending a ride if the vehicle is not standing upright. And also,
How do you define that? Standing upright?
they could put like a gyroscope or something like that to make sure that, because one of the problems is if they just park it anywhere and it falls over, it becomes.
So I'm glad that you raised that. I mean, that sounds great to me, but I'll throw it to DOT to see is that a technological challenge that would.
Come on, if we got a geofence.
I mean, I don't know. Is that a reasonable requirement that we could put on here? Because I'm certainly open to it. I think it's creative thinking. But let's put it to.
Yeah, I mean, I think like all of the technology, I think we're going to be learning as we go and working with other cities in terms of the technology. I think one of the exciting parts about opening up to multiple technology providers in the city is that you're already starting to hear different companies saying we can do that. And so I think that's one of the advantages of having multiple companies come to LA. And so I think it definitely within 6 months or even before that, that's something that we'll start tracking. We do know that gyroscopes are available and are part of the technologies. It's going to be a question of the production cycle for the technologies.
So maybe we put that recommendation in there, but we put it with some sort of reasonable time frame because they don't have it now.
Mm-hmm.
but it's a great suggestion. So the question is, how do we incorporate it in a way we can direct you as part of the regulations to add that in, giving checking with stakeholders to find what a reasonable time frame would be for making that a requirement.
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. I mean,
great. So that'll be one of the recommendations without objection that we'll add in at the end. But go ahead.
And the other two, I think no one's going to have a problem with these. And in the spirit of promoting self-regulation, I'd like to instruct LADOT to report back in 6 months on the development of additional ways operators have begun incentivizing good behavior and penalizing poor behavior, and recommendations on how we can require such incentives.
Well, they're going to be reporting back every 3 months, right? So add that to the list of quarterly reports, because we already are requiring a quarterly report back.
So back in 3 months, and or the next report, and then instruct LADOT and BSS to report back on the feasibility of installing bicycles and scooter corrals in high-traffic corridors, and institute geofencing around these corrals to require their use in those high-density areas.
Okay. Any comments or questions on that? Okay. So when we get to the final recommendations, we'll add those in. Ms. Rodriguez, you had some additional questions?
So no, just some parting words before I go to my next committee meeting. But again, thank you everyone for your work in this. And Mr. Rue, thank you. I think you pretty succinctly captured a number of the points that I wanted to bring up this afternoon. And again, and I think specifically what you also picked up on as it relates to locations for the pickups and drop-offs in particular corridors. We know one of the biggest challenges we have in the city of Los Angeles is the diversity of our neighborhoods and what that creates in terms of some of the dynamics that I think those that have piloted this early are struggling with right now. I think for many of our areas, it's really important for the local office to help be involved in determining where those locations would be best suited, given some of the dynamics in the neighborhoods and some of the community colleges and whatnot, and so that they don't have adverse impacts to the overall goal of making sure that we're creating multiple options for individuals. I was telling everyone, as a mother of an 18-year-old who still doesn't have his driver's license, we have to create a number of mobility options, and I'm excited about the opportunity that this provides us in the city to start regulating this in a thoughtful way. I do have concerns about the limitations of a 12-mile-per-hour speed limit. I don't know that is really conducive, given what I think is potentially average spike speeds in bike lanes. I want to make sure that we don't do anything to potentially obstruct. I think it would just be kind of a consistent adaptation. So I think for me, there are bigger issues that I struggle with as it relates to this policy, and it's more so about the pickup and drop-off locations, incenting good behavior, as you indicated, Mr. Rue, particularly among the users, so that there is a financial incentive for them to cooperate in the disposition of their ride at locations that have deemed less obstructive for pedestrians or any of the other bike lanes or activities that we have in our neighborhoods. But with that, I will allow my colleagues to complete the rest of this process, but thank you very much for your work.
We know you have to go to another committee. Thank you for the comments and all your contributions. Martinez.
Mr. Chair, getting back on the jurisdiction of who enforces the enforcement issue. So whose jurisdiction is it to enforce the riding on the sidewalks or riding without a helmet?
LAPD.
LAPD. I just so this is your enforcement flow chart that I looked at, and it just seems to me that I just don't understand why there's so many departments involved. I just think this creates for a situation where enforcement just becomes even more and more difficult. I mean, I don't know if you've looked at this.
So
have you guys seen this? No, seriously, there's two step twos. So you can either do step 2, which is there an issue, the step 1, and then to directly contact the Dockless operators, who then would have will receive notification and have about 2 hours to resolve the issue. Or you can go our route, which is identify the issue, call out 311, which 311 will then refer it to Bureau of Street Services. Then Street Services will tag it and contact Alley Sanitation. Alley Sanitation will they'll create a work order tag and tag the vehicle, and the bills will go directly to the general fund. And then there's also the maintenance labor piece. So that's that's way too complicated.
100% agree.
So
There,
this needs
there
to
has
be
been
improved,
that has been
'cause
revised.
This is why I think people become frustrated with the nuisance of seeing them spread all over the city or in their neighborhoods, because we don't seem to get ahead of the game, and we just go like this to each other, and this issue doesn't get resolved. So I think that we need to fix this before we end up in even more hot water. This is why people are upset. I don't think people debate the fact that this is here and that we need to find other modes of transportation, especially for young people. I'm certainly not as young, so I wouldn't be getting on any of these devices. But having said that, if you're a neighbor and you have a stack of these things laying around obstructing the public right-of-way, you're going to be mad. So I think we need to just fix this. The other thing I wanted to also talk a little bit about, and just because I was looking up what other cities are doing, and I thought that was just pretty cool. Do we plan to formalize a furniture zone? I know the city of Long Beach has done that, and they actually mark the drop zones for their e-scooters, and it looks something like this, which I thought was very cool. Mr. Busca, they're neighbors of your district. Have you seen it? In Long Beach, right? Not in San Pedro. Yeah. So I just thought this would be kind of something that we should be doing. Again, it's painted drop zones on sidewalks so people can easily see where they can actually park these devices. So I think we should also be moving in this direction. I know this isn't new to you, Salida. You're like, yeah, it's on my list. 7,500 miles. Yes, yeah. So I know, but I thought this, again, we should show this to Mr. Koretz. Right.
Right, commercial zones, right.
But this is very easy to spot. It's
Ms.
blue,
Reynolds, can
and
you come to the mic
exactly.
when, it's good to have the conversation, but I want the benefit of it being on the record.
So I apologize. I said it was very similar to the recommendation of your colleagues that we take a look once we can start getting data at high trafficked areas, and in particular, as Councilmember Rodriguez pointed out, in places that you all already know, you want to organize the sidewalk, and we get we start getting a look at that and incorporate that into the infrastructure that we're going to need to put in place, hopefully benefiting from the fees that we're going to get from this program to start organizing the public right-of-way in physical space, but also that we're having those data feeds and we can see where things are going.
I just wish that when we roll out these types of incentives, I wish we would have the infrastructure in place already so that people won't automatically feel so negative about it, because we create a situation where it's messy because we don't have our act together, and then we're trying to fix it, and by that time, we've got communities frustrated that don't even want to think about something like this. Same goes with the bikes. I just wish we can just get ahead of the game when we know this is already coming. It's coming, it's here to stay. Let's figure out a way where we can get ahead of the game. That's all.
Yeah, and I think that applies more broadly to all of the new mobility business models. As you know, these companies showed up in Santa Monica without any warning, right? They didn't tell the city they were coming. So we are looking at ways to get further upstream the product development cycle more broadly, because we know that this is not the end, right? Electric dockless mopeds are next. Small, lightweight neighborhood electric vehicles are after that, right? We know all these things are coming, so we're trying to get further upstream with them to find out where are you going and can we get ahead of it in marking, physical space and also getting data feeds ahead of time.
Right.
But I totally agree.
That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Buscaino.
Well, Ms. Martinez, let me confess that I've been one of the responsible parties of this disruption, because in my district, I couldn't wait to study the hell out of this issue. I said, come to my district, let's welcome dockless vehicles, and back in last fall, we were able to debut Lime Bike. And, we often say that the city of Los Angeles is the capital of innovation. But as a city, we need to encourage innovation, not stifle it by over-regulating, or not stifle it by making recommendations based on limited data. And just to let you know, it's been a success in my district since November of last year. We have had over 5,000 active riders. There have been over 900,000 rides in the city of LA since it's debuted. And there have been hardly any complaints. Now, we have the complaints of maybe a bike hanging out of a tree that's been posted on Facebook or thrown over Paseo del Mar. But Lime Bike has listened, they've been responsive, adapted, and grown with our community, and they have met with numerous community organizations and stakeholders before beginning the pilot and been very responsive. So they also send us bi-monthly high-level analytics. They're capturing GPS and heat mapping data in real time. And this, in general, has been a win for our district from Watts to the waterfront, particularly in those areas that have been overlooked for exciting pilot projects like this. Like, Nuri, you always say that we're two ends of the city, and we're often ignored, from your district to my district. And I'm happy that you led an effort on the developing a discounted permit fee to be applied in disadvantaged communities, and I applaud your efforts for that. The program to put bikes in disadvantaged communities is built around an incentive program. I'm supportive of that reduces the fees for bikes in these specific communities. I'd like to see potentially the use of tap cards. Is that a possibility of what's the prospect of incorporating bike payments on the tap cards? Is that possible working with our metro partners?
It's definitely something we can look into.
Okay.
Add it to the report back.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. As far as the safety piece, as a city, we can impose rules and regulations, but we can't control stupidity and personal irresponsibility. Put a damn helmet on. Slow down. That's something that we cannot control. We have bike lanes. We have protected bike lanes. This is an areas that we can continue to promote and encourage more of these locations so that people feel more comfortable hopping on a dockless bike or a scooter and getting onto the street. So we need to make sure that if we're going to encourage and promote multimodal transportation, we need to make sure that they're useful and people are comfortable using them. So as it relates to the speed of the scooters, my question is, how can we regulate the speed of scooters while we haven't regulated the speed of e-bikes? So I would like to amend the Dockless on-demand mobility rules and guidelines to add a 15 miles per hour speed limit for scooters to safety section page 4 and provide that the City Council revise speed limit based on collision and injury data as recommended by LADOT. So if I can have a second to that, that'll be really helpful. Thank you, David.
Just to be clear, you want to change what Transportation Committee opted in, which was 12 to 15, but with what provision at the end? Trying to allow City Council to revise speed limit based on the data. Now, Marcel, you said this industry is driven by data. So, if we have limited data on reducing the speed limit, or if no data, reducing the speed limit from 15 to 12, how can we make that commitment and that recommendation? So I would like to just keep it at 15 based on, my earlier comments is we can't stifle innovation with limited data and leave it at 15 miles an hour. Yeah,
I think it's worth noting that Lime scooters currently go 20 miles an hour.
Right.
So it's the same challenge. Whether it's 12 or 15, we're still going to have an enforcement mechanism to figure out how to keep those. We know they're going to be on the sidewalk. We know they're going to be on the LA River bike path. And we know they're going to be interacting with pedestrians. And so I think that's a little different than the bikes and a bigger challenge for us.
In the ideal world, and I just want to follow up on yours, because I'm willing to go there, although I'm uncomfortable raising it too high because they do end up on the sidewalks and other places. What I'd love to see is the technology at the level where we could regulate the speed on a street-by-street basis, on a sidewalk basis. I mean, it's not unimaginable that you could have it so that it cannot go more than 8 miles an hour on a sidewalk, and it can go 20 miles an hour on a fast road and 15 miles an hour on certain other roads. I mean, the technology is certainly there. It's just not being applied at the moment. So I guess I would accept your amendment, but I'd want to include in it a direction to DOT to investigate the possibility of requiring GPS street level speed governing, whether that's higher or lower. And I think that's kind of goes to your issue, because if we could lower the limit on sidewalks, because I know it's illegal to be on sidewalks, but realistically, we know people are going on sidewalks, and from a rational perspective, it makes sense. You can't get from Poly Pavilion to the Expo line. A lot of people use it. It's 3 miles. You'd be an idiot to go on the street in some of those streets. All those people are going to be on the sidewalks on certain parts. And there's lots of places in my area going from Pierce College to the Orange Line. We know routes that people are going to take. And we also know some of those routes it's appropriate to be fast, and some of them it's not. So
yeah, we also want to encourage people to use multimodal transportation. And if they're putting from point A to point B, they're going to hop in a car. So it defeats the purpose of lowering the carbon footprint and either hopping on a shared bike program or a scooter, or like Celia mentions, potentially a moped now that's coming our way. So again, just finding ways to make sure that this program is useful for everyone moving forward. So I'd like to take that as an amendment, and I appreciate your leadership on that, Mr.
I'll support it with the very minor amending motion to get it to go.
And also, who's to say that, for Christmas, my son got a Razor E300 last Christmas. And so he has a scooter that we personally own. And who's to say that, how are we going to regulate the speed and cite those for a scooter sharing program versus someone who personally owns a Razor that is a E300 scooter? So there's some fairness questions as well, and issues that I've raised. And I know that the E300 Razor goes faster than 15 miles per hour. And there's a lot of, what's that? I don't understand. We're not permitting those, but it's also a fairness issue from someone who's personally owns a scooter compared to a scooter sharing program.
If I could just add, the only thing I would request is that as we get the data in, and there may be something where we understand that there is a big issue around speed, because again, we don't actually currently have data. We have heard anecdotal information about crashes occurring on our streets, but we don't know that. As we get the data, the only amendment I would make or I would request is that you leave it to LADOT to actually make that call in real time as we need to, because in as much as we endeavor to get scheduled every 90 days, there may be some new information or new data that becomes available that we may want to act on for the good of the public safety. And so having to come back to committee to present findings, I think would actually be a little more challenging. And so I would just say, go 12 to 15, that's a policy decision. But in terms of allowing LADOT the ability to actually change that based on data that we get in real time, that's the only amendment I would ask.
Well, that's the whole purpose of looking forward to the next year, and what works, what doesn't work, and going back to, being the leading district in embracing multimodal transportation and dockless vehicles. We can turn to CD15 to see what works and what hasn't worked. But now we've seen other cities, other parts of the city, kind of be inundated with these dockless vehicles. But again, going back to why would we put some regulations on lowering the speed limit when we know if that's will work or will not work moving forward, and based on emergency room visits or doctor reports? That's something that, again, if we're going to encourage innovation,
let's roll it out. Let's roll it out
right.
first.
All right.
Thank you.
I've got one more question, and then I'm going to try to land this plane unless there's additional questions. The Mobility Plan 2035, the predecessor was the 2010 Bicycle Plan. They called for a network of bike paths and bike lanes, neighborhood network of safe, low-speed streets that prioritize non-car modes. It seems that if we actually built these networks with a focus on connections for major transit stations, colleges and universities, shopping centers, etc., we'd get more scooters off the sidewalks and onto the streets and onto the appropriate streets. Media reports show that the scooter operators in other cities are contributing to building this bike infrastructure that can be used by the scooters. Have we explored such an effort in LA? And how will LA DOT use scooter data to identify areas where such infrastructure is specifically needed and where we could use these funds or create targeted funds for these areas?
Councilmember, I think that that's an excellent suggestion. Funding is one of many challenges that the department faces when we try and go out and build out the network called for in Mobility 2035. Each of those projects is a community conversation and negotiation, and it's rare that the problem is that we don't have the money. So I think the thing that I would point to, though, that we don't have the money for is keeping our current network in a state of good repair. Bureau of Street Services, we're going to be bringing back a recommendation to the City Council looking at a comprehensive survey of the existing network. Initially, there's about 20% of it that is in poor or very poor condition that needs to be upgraded and repaired pretty much immediately. I would say that we might first try and upgrade and maintain and preserve what we have, and then bring the data before each of your offices and have a conversation about where there's a compelling need now to build out infrastructure for a broad user base, including people who are walking, biking, taking scooters, and then take a comprehensive look at all the funding sources we have available. And if we have a shortfall in certain areas, this might be one source that we look to. But I would say if I had my druthers, I'd point it first towards preserving the network that we have now, and then using the data to look at where we want to prioritize build out and figuring out whether or not the funding is the problem or the challenge, or there are other issues and challenges with, finding additional space in a built out right of way, which is not a challenge that's unique to Los Angeles.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to put forward some recommendations and then ask my colleagues to clarify the recommendations that they put forward earlier that we agreed on. So first, concur with Transportation Committee recommendations made on August 8th and June 27th with the following amendments. One, to recommendation 2A in the 818 recommendation to open the conditional permit to all companies capped at 1,500 vehicles. So it's what we discussed with the half opening to all comers but half. And to amend the recommendation 1 from the same report to, as we just discussed, from 12 miles an hour to 15 miles an hour. 2, to instruct LADOT to report back with recommendations for building out the bicycle and neighborhood enhanced networks to create safe alternatives to sidewalk riding for personal mobility devices, including fees necessary to make this happen, as we just discussed. And second, to request the city attorney to report back regarding potential legal liabilities that the city might face due to operation of personal mobility devices and strategies to mitigate those liabilities, including requiring operators to indemnify the city and or imposing fees to recover the expected liabilities. And we discussed that was early on. And then 3, to amend the recommendations to include in the parking section on page 8 a requirement that all dockless vehicles within 1 month come equipped or within amend the recommendation section 8, require all dockless vehicles come equipped with technology that would prevent operators from ending a ride if the vehicle is not standing upright. So to come back with recommendations, we didn't, the 3-month thing was on the report backs, but including this as an actual requirement, we can pick a time, or we could ask them to come up with we'd like you to come up with an appropriate time when that is a feasible alternative. It is a priority for us to make that happen. We want a feasible time frame that it can do so without that would be appropriate for the stakeholders and for the community. Also, to instruct LADOT to report back in 3 months on the development of additional ways operators have begun incentivizing good behavior and penalizing poor behavior, and recommendations on ways we can require such incentives. And to instruct LADOT and BSS to report back on the feasibility of installing bicycle and scooter corrals in high traffic corridors and institute geofencing around those corrals to require their use in high density areas. And the other one, I want to go back on the one where we amended the recommendation from 12 miles an hour to 15 miles an hour. We also wanted to add in the requirement that they report back on ways to use technology to create a variable, speeds depending on either the street or the conditions. When we'd like that to be possible, when it's feasible. But was there any other recommendations? Did you have another one? I think I covered everybody's.
Yeah, you did. Again, on the miles per hour from 12 to 15, it will just continue to, give the city council the opportunity to revise the speed limit based on collision and injury data as recommended by DOT.
So put it to 15 immediately?
Yes.
Which will be different than what's recommended by DOT, so that'll probably be one of the issues that comes in conflict in the council.
Yes.
But then adding on a new provision, which is not in conflict, potentially, which would be giving the city council, or are we giving it to DOT?
City council authority. So
conflict?
It is in conflict, yeah. So it would be based on collision and injury data as recommended by DOT. So it will
down the road.
So we'll probably
it's an immediate 15 mile an hour, and then do you want to say a year later do that, or 6 months
no,
later?
it'd be based on the data that comes back on collision and injury.
I think we have to have a time frame because we don't have the data yet. So to say that they can do it based on the data at the moment.
So I just want to redline DOT and have this revised speed limit based on collision and injury data as recommended. So have give the city council authority instead of DOT.
Give the city council authority to change the speed limit in the future.
In the future, correct.
I think we already have it, but you're expressly taking it away from DOT.
Correct. We get the complaints.
Is there discussion about?
No, I think Transportation Committee recommended to go to 12. So I think our committee, we want to recommend it to go back to 15, and this will probably be resolved in City Council.
Right.
But then, so what we want to do is we want to I think what Councilman Buscaino wants to do is put it back to the original recommendation, original DOT recommendation of 15 miles an hour.
Correct.
And which will ultimately be subject to change based on data. So I don't mind putting a 6-month or a 1-year time frame for us to revisit this issue. I don't mind that.
And we're happy to I'm happy to put it in. I think we have the authority. We don't have to give ourselves that authority. We can always change it.
That's fine too.
So I think it's a belt and
So
suspenders.
we could reevaluate speeds in 6 months, since they come back every 3 months. So we'll say in 6 months based on the data and based on your addition to the amendment of seeing if they could do variable speeds based on terrain and GPS and all of that. So that will give us additional opportunity to see how it works.
So to be clear, because I know Mr. Espinosa is hearing a lot of things. Number one, all the other recommendations I think were clear and accepted as all on consent. This recommendation is to go change it back to the DOT recommendation of 15 miles an hour versus 12 miles an hour.
Correct.
Period. Secondly, to ask for report backs on on a quarterly basis on whether the data shows alternative speeds that would be appropriate, and to give the council the opportunity to change if it so desires.
Yes, based on injury and collision reports,
collision, which we have that authority, but we're going to explicitly state it. Belt and suspenders make it clear that we have that authority. And then third was sort of my pie in the sky thing about look in the future, ask for report backs on the possibility of having speeds that are regulated based on geography and exact locations in the future. Because that would be, I think, solve a lot of these problems if the technology could catch up to that. And we want to figure out ways to incentivize that potentially. But we can't ask for that at the moment, but we can ask for report backs on that on a regular basis, on that possibility. So people know, that the industry knows, if they're listening, that that's where we want to go, and you can get higher speeds if you can get that technology to us. And with that, seeing no objection, that will be the order. And that concludes that item. Is there any other business before us, Mr. Espinosa?
No, Mr. Chair.
No other comments? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.